Now let's return to our top story, Israel's unrelenting offensive in Gaza. For more than 3 weeks, Israel has been targeting Rafah in southern Gaza with airstrikes and bombings. It says the offensive is necessary to destroy the remaining Hamas battalions and free the hostages, but the cost to Palestinian lives has been incredibly high. On Sunday, 45 civilians in a camp for displaced people were killed, and strikes on the night of Monday to Tuesday killed 16 more, according to Hamas officials. Tens of thousands of families have had to flee, and there are now eyewitness reports that several Israeli tanks have gone into the center of Rafah. With more on this, let's speak to Arise special correspondent Carl Bostic, who joins me on the line from Tel Aviv. Good to see you, Carl. And on that last point I was just talking about there, specifically that Israeli forces with tanks have moved deeper into Rafah and are now in the town center. What more do we know about that?
That's right, Charles. As you correctly mentioned, despite the International Court of Justice ruling on Friday to halt the fighting, and despite the catastrophic strike, which triggered a massive fire, killing more than 40 people Sunday into Monday, nonetheless, and the mounting international outcry, latest reports show that now Israeli tanks have moved into the center of Rafah. That's the southernmost point of Gaza. Charles, about a week ago, there may be more than 1 million people in Rafah, but because of the offensive, they've fled the city. So now you still have maybe about 500,000 left. It's very, very densely populated. And again, Rafah, it's basically a quarter of the size of Abuja, where you are, but still you have nearly 500,000 people there, densely populated, and there are tanks sited near the main mosque inside Rafah. Essentially, basically, the Israeli military is saying that this offensive will continue until we can uproot Hamas, which still remains intact. That's the last location where they remain intact, and they feel that using this pressure will increase the possibility of releasing some of the hostages.
And Carl, as you said there, we've heard from the UN Refugee Agency in Gaza, UNRWA, saying that up to 1 million people have fled Rafah in the past 2 weeks. That's a huge number, but I wonder where they're actually going.
Well, Charles, once again, you're always answering your question, because what reports on the ground are suggesting that a lot of people are in this kind of facing this very dilemma that you're referring to, because right now, as UN agencies and aid agencies say, there is nowhere safe to go in Gaza. The 25-mile strip of land, it's an enclave, a quarter the size of Abuja. Rafah is an eighth the size of Abuja. And in terms of where can they go, there is nowhere safe to go where there's shelter, food, water, or sanitation. And that's why some families are simply saying that it's better to stay in Rafah, despite the risk of a strike, which could see another inferno, which happened Sunday into Monday. That's what we're looking at right now in terms of the dilemma facing Gazans on the ground inside Rafah.
And this shows, doesn't it, how deep Israel has moved, essentially from being around the periphery right into the heart of Rafah. So Rafah, which they portrayed as a safe haven for more than 1 million displaced Palestinians, has absolutely now become the focus of Israel's military campaign.
Unfortunately, Charles, you are right. Just to give an example, even with this mass exodus, it's still densely populated, and where are hundreds of thousands of people living? They're not even living in permanent structures. They're inside of tent camps. And that's why you had this, inferno the other day, because now the Israelis, they're pushing back. They're saying that with their strike Sunday into Monday, actually, they unloaded or dropped 2 of their smallest possible bombs, 2 37-pound bombs, in an effort to kill 2 Hamas operatives, which they said they did complete. However, that triggered a secondary explosion near what could have been an ammunition warehouse or compound near one of the tents. That's what they're saying what happened. It's so densely populated. And again, Charles, yesterday, we were talking about the Egyptian soldier, who was killed by Israeli military. That's because the Israeli military, they're now inside Rafah, in the center of Rafah, and they're looking for tunnels, which have been a lifeline for smuggling weapons, fighters, and rockets into Gaza. And apparently, what happened was the Egyptian military guard opened fire on the Israelis who were at the entrance to a tunnel. They exchanged gunfire, but the Egyptian media is already saying that we don't want to let this become bigger than it already is. This is not our priority. That's why it's such a fragile, tense, precarious situation right now as we speak.
And of course, Israel paying no heed at all, Carl, to the international condemnation of what happened at the weekend, and in fact today as well, when Israeli airstrikes killed 45 Palestinian civilians at that tented camp, and we're hearing of another 16 or 20 killed again overnight today.
Unfortunately, Charles, I hate to say it, that this could actually still continue, barring action by the Security Council, because Friday's ruling by the International Court was vague enough or ambiguous enough for Israel to say that, well, we can still carry out our offensive. What's missing, Charles, is the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the U.S. They're the biggest diplomatic and military backer of Israel. Without U.S. support, Israel cannot survive sanctions from Security Council. That's why you've got this closed session today. And U.S. has always exercised its veto. But in a breakaway from this tradition, Charles, as you just earlier were reporting and discussing in the studio, now you've got European countries, Norway, Ireland, and Spain recognizing a Palestinian state. But also you've got the European Union, the EU now discussing the possibility of imposing its own sanctions. That's never happened before, sanctions against Israel. So actually, Charles, this is day to day. These next few days could be very, very tense. But the U.S., meanwhile, is simply saying that we defend Israel's right to go after Hamas. It's a shared goal. However, they must take extreme precaution to protect the lives of civilians. It's a big, big, tough ask, Charles, when you're such a densely populated area that's also filled with fighters and ammunition.
And that recognition, Carl, I mean, does anyone in Israel, where you are, think that these European countries recognizing Palestine will make any difference? I mean, I understand there have been lots of angry comments in Israel.
Charles, it's simply amazing what's going on here. You know, you've got the Israeli foreign minister saying that Spain is complicit in inciting genocide against the Israeli people. One telling detail is that the latest poll amongst Israelis here, where I am, I'm here in Tel Aviv, about 65% of Israelis are at this moment against any idea of a Palestinian state because of what's going on, and especially because no hostages have been released yet. So there's real anger against, quite frankly, the international criticism. And at the same time, though, internally, Charles, they're not happy with the government. They're saying that the Prime Minister Netanyahu should resign now. 71% say that, or else as soon as the war is over. But to give another example, Charles, of just how much division there is, even in Europe, for example, Charles, you had Denmark, the parliament, voting down a bill to recognize Palestine. In France today, Charles, you had the lower session canceling its session after one of its lawmakers raised a Palestinian flag. So there's utter confusion and even chaos diplomatically.
But I wonder, Carl, if all of that is having any impact in Israel towards people perhaps pushing their governments to end the war in Gaza, because that is why you're getting a lot of this international condemnation. I mean, I wonder what the mood is. Is it starting to fracture a bit in Israel?
Well, that fracture is a widening fracture, Charles, and it's a deepening fracture. I'll just tell you something, for example. One of the most widely respected columnists in the Israel print media in the Haaretz newspaper, which is center to left leaning. He basically came out saying that Israel may have to consider a ceasefire into the fighting without even a hostage deal. It's gotten so bad. So for the first time, it's being suggested that, you know something, we can't afford to be weakened or isolated any further. We need to maybe have put an end to this fighting, put a pause, or declare a ceasefire without even a hostage deal. And that is not, again, a good ask for the Israeli people, especially, Charles. Yet another hostage video is released today by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Again, no idea when it was dated, but it showed a young person from kibbutz basically pleading, for his life and the Israeli government to stop the fighting. We don't know when that was shot. It could have been months ago. So there's a lot of psychological warfare going on here, Charles. But the people here, they're angry at the government for its failure to prioritize the return of about 120 hostages. I'll add one final detail, Charles. Egypt's trying to revive the talks, and now Israel is loosening its criteria, saying that it's willing to not set a limit or term in terms of how many living hostages can be returned. Because quite frankly, Charles, the consensus is many, if not most of the hostages are no longer even alive today.
Listening to you there, Carl, what I find absolutely astonishing is that after all these months with Israel's enormous firepower raining down on Gaza, you've still got militant groups able to put together videos and publish them and have the internet capacity to send things out and so on. I mean, that just it boggles the mind when you think of the amount of firepower that's been rained down on Gaza.
That's right, Charles. I mean, listen, I've been here since the war started, 2 days after it started, and in the beginning they were unloading, dumping 2,000-pound bombs, more than half of its munitions. 25,000 munitions. Now they're using even surgical strikes, Charles, and it's still not making a difference. I think what's really so worrisome. The short story is this: you still have the leadership of Hamas intact. That was their stated goal to find, kill, or remove Yahweh Sinwar. He's still nowhere to be found after 8 months. You still have more than 120 hostages in Gaza, many, if not most of them, presumed to be dead. So after 8 months, that's not happened. So what's been accomplished? And meanwhile, you have got the latest debacle of what happened just 2 days ago. And that's why there's a very uncomfortable silence coming from Washington. We haven't heard the President Joe Biden, speak directly to this. We're hearing kind of basically almost ambiguous statements coming from the Security Council spokespeople, basically saying that, we share the goal of removing Hamas because that's is a shared goal and outcome, understandably. But they're also saying we have to take precautions to remove the civilians. Charles, that's why there's mounting pressure to say that enough is enough. The Security Council has to levy out impose sanctions. And then finally, Charles, that recognition you referred to by Spain leading this charge, they're simply saying, as I mentioned the other day, Charles, is that the U.S. is not the only one to decide what's the best way to ensure a durable, sustainable peace. Maybe by recognizing a Palestinian state, maybe that's the way to create the momentum for a Palestinian state. And as the Irish Foreign Minister says, this is in no way equating a free Palestinian state with legitimizing Hamas. So, that's just how tangled it is right here in Israel.
I think tangled is a good word. And talking about a durable peace, Carl, there was talk of peace talks restarting this week. What are you hearing about that from your Israeli contacts?
Well, again, Charles, what's going on is that Egypt, is really it's kind of like a tug of war between Egypt and Qatar in terms of who's taking the initiative in moderating a deal. In many ways, Israel needs Egypt more than it needs Qatar. Qatar only holds the cards because it has the hostages. Egypt is the most important Arab ally for Israel right now. There's a sense that it could be a make or break thing where they just need to simply, as this opinion columnist I mentioned, Charles, they may have to accept their losses and agree to a ceasefire and an end to the war without even a hostage deal. That's now being floated, which is simply astounding and amazing. And that's why you've got the protests going on. But to give another example just how tangled it is, Charles, you've got the famous author Salman Rushdie, who is no stranger to terrorism, after suffering an attack himself. Salman Rushdie says to recognize a Palestinian state right now would be to capitulate to Hamas.
Very unfortunate there, but we seem to have lost comms with our special correspondent Carl Bostic, who was talking to me on the line there from Tel Aviv.